Episode of AIMA's popular Leaders Speak series. Today, we are privileged to have Mr. T V Narendran, CEO and Managing Director, Tata Steel, as a guest speaker. Mr. Narendran, it's a pleasure to have you with us, and many thanks for agreeing to do this session.
Not at all. My privilege.
Thank you. You head one of India's oldest and most iconic companies, and your leadership has exemplified change with continuity. During the pandemic, you have led the company with outstanding ingenuity and agility and have not allowed the disruption to bog it down. Tata Steel has always been a great supporter of AIMA, and you personally have been always generous with your time to participate in AIMA activities. So thank you once again. Thank you very much. Mr.
Awesome.
Singhania, always a pleasure to have you with us, and many thanks for moderating the interaction today, and a very warm welcome to you and to Mr. Narendran and to all others who are here. Ladies and gentlemen, today's topic is leadership in the time of pandemic, managing risks and opportunities. This is something that all of us have been battling with since March this year. We have all tried to do our best to survive the pandemic and come out as winners, but some of us have done it better than others. Leadership has been the difference between business continuity and business disruption during this trying period. However, a tougher test awaits leaders after the unlocking. The pandemic has triggered significant changes in operations, markets, and competition, and leaders need to sharpen their instincts to guarantee a future for their organizations. Yet, with daunting challenges, there are always new openings, and those who manage the new risks and opportunities well will come out better after the pandemic than before. Today's session is an opportunity to discuss these issues with Mr. Narendran, and I urge the audience to be ready with their questions for him. It is now my pleasure to invite Mr. Singhania to start the discussion. Over to you, Mr. Singhania.
Thank you very much, Rekha. Am I audible clearly? Okay,
Yes.
great.
Yeah.
Mr. Narendran, Rekha, all members of AIMA and participants at this event, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to have you with us for a dialogue on the leadership at the time of pandemic. We are privileged indeed to have Mr. T V Narendran, CEO and Managing Director, Tata Steel, to share with us his views on managing risks and opportunities in the prevailing situation. Mr. Narendran, it's a pleasure to have you, and thank you for being readily to share your ideas on crisis management with our audience. The steel sector was hit hard during the lockdowns, but you found ways to steer your company through the trouble and bring its production back to 100%. We would like to understand how you did it and what we can learn from your experience. In fact, most manufacturing companies in India have been through a rough time. Supply chains were disrupted and sale of most products came to a standstill during the lockdown. India's government imposed one of the most severe lockdowns in the world. And subsequent states and districts imposed their own lockdowns. It became challenging to bring workers into factories or to deliver products to customers. The companies that produced intermediate goods with long and complex supply chains faced great hardships. Companies with a global footprint tried to export their way out of the jam or tried to push production and sales in the countries where the disruption was less severe. While conditions have improved in India after the national unlocking, the troubles of manufacturing companies, or indeed of many companies across sectors, are yet far from over. COVID is unfortunately not going away in a hurry, and a viable vaccine is yet to be fully identified. Return of restrictions cannot be ruled out, as is happening in Europe following the second wave of the pandemic. Companies have to be prepared for unpredictable supply chains and markets. The damage to the economy could increase prices and suppress demand. Both producers and consumers are likely to remain cautious with spending in the short to medium term. The government can give a fillip perhaps to demand by accelerating its own investment, as private and foreign investment will depend on demand being created first. Manufacturing companies are more likely to tighten their belts than to spend on growth. Alternately, the government can leave more money in the hands of companies and consumers to encourage them to invest and spend respectively. Prolonged cautious of business and consumers will result in tardy growth over the medium term. On the positive side, however, the crisis will force companies, or is actually forcing companies, to become more efficient and resilient, change their business models, which will allow them to grow rapidly once the effects of the pandemic subside. The need is to act with urgency instead of waiting for perfect information and perfect ways of doing business as we have been doing in the past. We are delighted, therefore, that we have Mr. Narendran with us today to reflect on how he believes we can overcome the current challenges and capitalize on new opportunities. Mr. Narendran, though he needs no introduction, is a veteran of an industry which makes most other industries possible and has had extensive experience of doing business globally. He has been with Tata Steel for more than 3 decades, as Rekha has already talked about, and has spent a lot of his time overseas building markets for Indian steel exports. He played a key role in Tata Steel's first overseas acquisition, Nat Steel. He's on the boards of Tata Steel and Tata Steel Europe. He's also a key member of many international business bodies, including World Steel Association, BRICS Business Council, the Indo-French CEO Council, to name a few, and more importantly, currently serving as in a very senior capacity, rather as Vice President at CII. Narendran ji, it is my pleasure to now invite you to share your thoughts with us today. Thank you very much. We look forward
Thank
to it.
you. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Singhania. Thank you, Rekha, for having me. Thank you all for dialing in. It's always a pleasure and privilege to talk at AIMA events. Uh, the subject is leadership in the time of a pandemic, but I'm going to make it a little bit more generic and talk about leadership in a crisis, not so much about pretending to be an authority on the subject, but I've experienced a fair share of crisis, so I'll just share with you what I've learned from that. And to me, I'll make these generic points which are relevant to everyone, and I'll probably emphasize what I'm saying with some examples from Tata Steel, which will help you connect with a little bit more ground reality than just having a theoretical lecture. I would also like to limit my speech to 15-20 minutes and do a Q&A, because that way I'm talking about what interests you more than talking about what interests me. So with that, let me kind of get started. So the first question one has to ask ourselves is, how good are we at anticipating events like these? Obviously a pandemic happens once in 100 years. Tata Steel can claim to have experienced 2 pandemics. We were there in the first pandemic also. But having said that, I think what is important for organizations is how do you pick up early warning signals? How do you anticipate a crisis as much as possible? How do you pick the signals as early as possible? Even if you can't anticipate a crisis well ahead, there are some who pick up the signals faster than the others. And that makes a big difference in a crisis like this. And if any of you are sports fans, you will realize that the best of players, if you look at the best cricket players, best tennis players, best football players, best squash players, whatever, they seem to have a lot of time, right? Very few of them are hurried. The really good players are never hurried. That's because they anticipate things a fraction of a second before the other person. And you see that so clearly on tennis courts, where you have people scrambling around and there are people who seem to have all the time, right? So that is, to me, how we should look at ourselves as organizations. It's not necessary you predict everything accurately, but if you have the ecosystem, if you have the processes in place to pick up those signals, even the weak signals, and build on them, and have an organization that can respond to it, have the resilience to deal with it, then you're in a better shape than everybody else. So if I look at a classical approach for organizations, the first question is, do you have a proper risk management process? This sounds a bit theoretical, and oftentimes in organizations, it is left to the finance folks to develop a framework and run with it. The business guys are not very involved, but that isn't how it works, right? To me, it's has to be integrated with the way we manage our businesses. The identification of risks have to come bottom up and top down. It has to come outside in and inside out, and it has to go on continuously because it's not static. It's a very dynamic environment. You need to revisit your frameworks. You need to revisit what you have in your risk matrix. You need to revisit the scores, the likelihood of events happening, the impact of it happening, the velocity with which it will happen, and then keep looking at it. And so that's why I'm saying it's very, very important for the business people to own it. You may have a risk team who can help make it happen, but they are not the owners of the risk management practices that you have. And I think over the last 4, 5, 6 years, Tata Steel has built a fairly robust risk management program and a risk management process for which we've been featured and awarded at multiple forums. And I think that has helped us anticipate many of the risks that have come our way. I will not say it has helped us anticipate the pandemic, but because we are not busy putting out many other fires, we have more time to focus on this fire, right? Otherwise, organizations are so distracted managing other risks, they should have done a better job of anticipating that they don't have enough time for the risks that they could not have anticipated, right? And even then, even in the case of the pandemic, for most of us, I think till the middle of March, we thought that this is something happening in China, right? We said it's a problem in Wuhan, okay, it's spread to Europe. From our point of view, because we have a big footprint in Europe, we started seeing the impact of this sometime in February in Europe, because by early February, Italy was in bad shape. Tata Steel Europe has a big footprint in Europe, in Netherlands and in the UK. And we saw our customers getting affected. We saw employees getting affected. We had the first few cases of COVID in plants in Europe. And we started seeing this thing spreading quite rapidly in Europe. And we started realizing that this was not a problem in China. This is going to be a problem everywhere else. And I would say we probably started reacting in India or preparing in India maybe 2-3 weeks before most others did. Because by end February, we realized that this is something which could come to us in India. We started making teams. We started, because, you know, for Tata Steel, it's not just running a steel plant. We also run a township. We run a hospital, a 1,000-bed hospital. So we are also responsible to the community. So we needed to be prepared. We started ordering ventilators, I think sometime in the end of February, because we had maybe 50, 60 ventilators in our hospital. We knew that won't be enough. And so there are many, we started ordering PPE and things like that sometime in end Feb, early March. Okay. Now this gave us 2-3 weeks lead time, because by the time the pandemic hit us and we had the lockdown, there were no ventilators or PPE available for some time, right? So even our community response, we were slightly better prepared. I wouldn't say we were perfect, but we were slightly better prepared because we started working on it maybe a couple of 2-3 weeks ahead. We started embedding it into our risk process. We started looking at what is the impact, what could happen, and started thinking about what could be the mitigating actions and things like that. So the point I'm making is have a strong risk management process. It's you can do it internally, you can hire consultants, but most important is it is not about somebody else doing it for you. It has to be owned by the business. In Tata Steel, it's part of all our reviews. We first discuss what are the risks in that business. How is it playing out? Has the likelihood of its occurrence increased or reduced? Has a potential impact increased or reduced? What has changed? So on and so forth. Maybe a year back or so, or a couple of years back, we were modeling around what happens if the Straits of Hormuz are closed, because we get a lot of limestone from the Middle East. So can we develop alternate limestone sources, which may be more expensive? Even in the more recent past, we've been looking at what is the impact of India's geopolitical relationship with China. What are the consumables which come from China? What are the other alternate sources you could have? How much more will it cost? How do you budget for that? So this has to be very integrated with the way we work. And I think that's, to me, the lesson one. And, I would urge all of you who don't have a proper risk management process to really think about how do you deploy it. The second point is, as good as your processes are in anticipating things, the question is, how do you respond, right? Even if you have the best of warnings, you have all the lead time, if you waste it, then there's no point having a strong, robust process if your response is not good enough. And I think this is where leadership plays a very, very important role. Leadership has to be engaged, deeply engaged. Leadership has to be visible. And it's not necessary that leadership needs to micromanage your way out of the solution. Leadership should be available, should be accessible. Because sometimes if leadership tries to micromanage a way out of the crisis, you get in the way, right? And a crisis is the right time to empower people, because multiple decisions have to be taken down the line. And if you or if you've always centralized or during a crisis start centralizing decision making, you're again going to be in a lot of trouble, because the speed of response is important. I think while even Tata Steel and many of us anticipated that this was happening and we started working on it, the lockdown was quite swift, right? And then how do you respond to that? And I think Mr. Singhania talked of supply chains. We have a very long supply chain. We have material coming from Australia, from China, from Europe. We have material coming from Gujarat, from Tamil Nadu, from everywhere, and to multiple sites, right? And sometimes it's that one truck which has got stuck somewhere, which can stop a steel plant which is producing 10 million tons a year, right? So when the lockdown was announced, a couple of things happened. One is, of course, like I said, leadership was totally engaged. We used to have daily calls, the top leadership team, no presentations, half an hour, 45 minutes on the phone, everyone talking about the issues they're facing, who's going to deal with it, what decisions need to be taken. The first few days was just about keeping the supply chain going, because steel being an essential part of the Essential Services Act, we had the permission to keep the steel plant going. But that permission is of no use if you can't get the critical consumables into the plant. If your suppliers are closed, it really doesn't help that you have the permission to operate. So it was more about tracking truckloads, tracking ships, tracking material being downloaded at the ports, making sure that it comes in, and so on and so forth. So our meetings used to be led by the supply chain team, because that was where all of us were focused. And in a crisis, it is very important to decide what you want to focus on and what you don't want to focus on, right? Because it's very easy to get distracted by 101 small things which are happening, right? But as a leadership team, you have to be focused. So if supply chain is a focus, let everyone get focused on the supply chain. The marketing and sales guys may be having problems in the market, but let's worry about that later. Let's sort out the supply chain as far as incoming inputs are concerned. So things like that. So you really need to be sharp in your focus. You need to be available. The cadence of meetings need to change. If you were earlier having meetings once a week, you need to have it daily. If you're having it daily, you may need to have it twice a day, because obviously the speed at which things are developing, the impact and the interdependencies play out. And there is a need for leadership, like I said, not to get into the way, but to be available, visible, engaged, because employees are also confused. And if they find that leadership is not available, or leadership looks like they are detached from reality, that doesn't inspire much confidence. There is also a need to find that balance between being confident and bringing in a sense of urgency. You know, it's finding the balance between urgency and panic. You know, you should have a sense of urgency, but not to create panic, right? And you should have a sense of urgency, because people can't sit back saying that, okay, we'll sort things out. Things will get sorted out themselves, you know. So these are the fine balances, and there is a very thin line which divides these phases. And so it's very, very important to do that. Yeah. And like I said, empowerment is very important as long as there is alignment. If everyone is aligned what they need to focus on, then you empower them to do it. If they're not aligned, empowering them can be a disaster, right? So there is a need to drive that alignment, empower, so that you can move fast. So from a Tata Steel point of view, the first 2 weeks was all about, you know, getting the supply chain going, and we could run the plant 100% full out in those last 2 weeks of March, despite there being a lockdown, because we were allowed to operate. Of course, we also had to put in protocols in place for the workers coming into the factories. We had to make sure that the sanitization was done. We had to make sure that we followed all the local rules. And suddenly you also realized how important local relationships were. It didn't matter how strong your relationship was in Delhi or in the state capital, but ultimately it was about the relationship at the district level and with the local authorities, which made sure that you know, your plants could be operating and you could move your trucks in or out or whatever else, right? So there is a lot of that kind of engagement which needs to be done, which is part of the response. And over the first 2-3 weeks, the whole focus was on the supply chain. But once we got the supply chain going and we knew that we could run the plant and it would not shut because of want of inputs, then we started focusing on the output. Because what was happening is most of our customers, or almost all our customers, were closed. So we had the permission to produce steel. We had sorted out the supply chain to keep the plant running, but there was no place to sell the steel to. And steel is, you know, capital. I mean, there's a lot of capital which goes into the working capital in steel, right? And Tata Steel produces 1.5 million tons a month in India, right? So for us, if you're not selling 1.5 million tons of steel in a month, you're looking at 4,000 or 5,000 crores of working capital being invested every month. And you don't have that kind of money at that point in time, because the whole focus is also on cash flows. And to say that, how do you make sure that you don't just spend cash to keep material on the ground? So two things happened. We said, okay, let's now start working on the front side, which is the customer side. We realized, and very surprisingly for us and pleasantly for us, the biggest fear for us when the pandemic was raging in China was, will China start exporting a lot of steel? Because we had gone through this in 2015, it almost, and we were very watchful of what's going to happen in China. Is China going to start dumping steel in the world markets? But very surprisingly, by end of March, or rather by middle of April, China started bouncing back. China had a V-shaped recovery. China very quickly moved from being a net exporter of steel into a net importer of steel. And so suddenly, not only Tata Steel, but all my other colleagues from the steel industry said that, hey, this is great. 3 years back, we were complaining about China dumping steel in India. Now there's a great opportunity for India to sell steel into China. And, all the Indian producers started exporting steel to China. That was the only market which was growing in demand and was consuming steel. And the pivot from the domestic market to the exports helped us start ramping up our production, because we had cut it down to about 50% in April and May, because we didn't want to just add inventory and get cash stuck on the ground. And so exports. But then the challenge with exports is also, again, particularly in Eastern region, we have few ports. Ports become a bottleneck. The infrastructure that is required to move large volumes to export markets suddenly is not there. And so all this became a bottleneck. So the whole focus shifted to the outbound supply chain rather than the inbound supply chain, which was a focus. Focus shifted to export markets, international markets, so on and so forth. And that was the pivot that helped us and the rest of the industry deal with that quarter, which was a very critical quarter, much better than we had anticipated when there was a complete lockdown. The third point I want to make is a crisis, and this is very cliched, a crisis is also an opportunity. Okay, and the real thing is there are many things you can do only in a crisis. Okay, we have experienced this before. So always, whenever there's a crisis, we ask ourselves, what is it that we can do during a crisis which you couldn't have done otherwise, right? About 5 years back, our iron ore mines, which have been running for 100 years, got closed. And for the first time in our life, our plant was not running at full capacity. So because we didn't have enough iron ore, we had to import the iron ore from Australia. So at that time, we realized that when you have a crisis, when your plant is not running at full capacity, there are many experiments you can do, which you can't do when the plant is running at full capacity. In a steel plant, getting the coal blend right is a very, very important element of your cost position, because then you'll get the right blends of coals and optimize on the cost without compromising on the quality or the performance, right? So we did experiments at that time, and which helped us in the subsequent years. I mean, we probably saved about 500 to 1,000 crores a year, which is very important, because we spent about 15,000 crores a year on coal. So for us, it was a very big part of that experiment that we did in 2014, which helped us save costs subsequently. Similarly, at this time, we said, hey, what are the projects that we can do today? Because the plant is not running full out, there is capacity available. What are the grades that we can produce, which are bottleneck grades, which are low productive grades? What are the sizes we can produce, which typically you wouldn't like to produce because the productivity comes down? Because productivity was not, I mean, your capacity was no longer the constraint. So you didn't mind producing products which were difficult to produce because you had all the time in the world. So you need to make a list of things that you can only do during a crisis. You know, one of the journeys that Tata Steel had embarked on over the last few years is our digital transformation journey, right? And we just got accelerated into it. And luckily, we had invested in a lot of infrastructure over the last few years. And so the shift from working in the office and working in the factory to remote working happened very smoothly. Like I was just discussing with Mr. Singhania, many of us had Microsoft Teams or Zooms on our devices, but we never used it till March, right? Because we always found it easier to walk into a video conference room or a telepresence room, whereas you could sit in your house or in your office and do what you want to do like you're doing today, right? So it also is an opportunity to accelerate into the future, do things that the organization would say, hey, why should I do it like this? Why can't I physically travel and meet somebody? So suddenly you say that this is a mass training program. You are training everybody and preparing them for the future, not because that's the right thing to do because you don't have a choice. And so a crisis that way is an opportunity. And, so to me, always I would say, don't waste a crisis and really make a list of things that, you can only do during a crisis. A crisis like this also gives you a lot of data points. It tells you where is your organization strong, where is it weak. It gives you a lot of data points on your leadership team and on the people below that. Who are the people who are thriving in a crisis? Who are the people who are crumbling in a crisis? Who are the people who are, challenged by it and excited by it and wanting to really bat on the front foot, even though it's a crisis, right? And who are the people who are running for cover? Which are the processes in the organization which are resilient? Which are the processes which are weak? Which part of your supply chain is vulnerable in a crisis? So there's a huge amount of data which comes your way. It is like going for a medical checkup, right? You get a lot of, so to me, every crisis is like a medical checkup. You get a lot of data. You may do nothing with it, like you also do when you have a medical checkup, or you may decide to change your lifestyle, right? So to me, a crisis also helps you reflect on the organization. And hopefully each crisis, if you come out of it well, take the learnings from it, build the resilience that is important, you're better prepared for the next crisis. Even if you don't anticipate the next crisis, you're not wasting your time dealing with fires, which should have been dealt with anyways, right? So which brings me to my penultimate point, which is about how do you build resilience, right? And that is really the learning we should take from every crisis. How do you build resilience in the people? How do you build resilience in the process? How do you build resilience in your whole ecosystem? And what are the learnings that you can take from every crisis to improve structurally and systemically your organization so that you're better equipped to deal with the future? And which brings me to the last point, use a crisis to accelerate into the future. I think this pandemic has helped us all accelerate into the future. It has also helped us all recalibrate both our personal and professional lives. It has suddenly reminded us what is truly important. It has suddenly allowed us to experience what is truly special, right? And in many ways, it has opened up our eyes. And I think all of us are hopefully wiser, if not healthier. I mean, those of us who are impacted by COVID physically, obviously, we are recovering from it. But those who are not, or otherwise, I think we are richer in some sense of the term from this experience. And so I look at it always positively. Don't assume that you will go through life professionally or personally without a problem. Those problems will be there. What is in your control is how you respond to it. And I think that's what as leaders you should always look out for. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Narendran, for very lucid comments. And what I liked particularly was you kept it very simple and without getting into, pardon the pun, management jargon. We are a management body, but All India Management Association, but without getting into that, but really taking examples from what you actually did, which I think all people in this audience can relate to. And these were not extraordinary things, quite frankly.
Yeah.
But they were things which were prioritized, and which, when I was hearing you, I said, oh my God, these are many of these things, we all know we ought to be doing, but sometimes we don't pay enough attention to those, and we get caught up in other extraneous stuff. And it's really going down to the basics. And I think this was brilliant. Now we have some questions for you. I think people are you have whetted their appetites, and there are many questions here. I'll try and sort of put some of them there, and so there are all kinds, and I'll try and sort of put them in certain buckets if I can.
Sure.
So sort of taking on some questions here, and I'll try and put a couple of them together perhaps, and then maybe you have your on there. One question is regarding saying that given the current situation that is happening between India and China, and Tata Steel being a global company, do you have any plans, thoughts around how you're going to think around those issues? And it's also a different kind of crisis or a different kind of issue happening. So that's one area. Maybe relating to that is some, a member of ours wants to know about plans around Atmanirbhar Bharat. If I can venture to say, Tata Steel is Atmanirbhar Bharat, from mobile, and like all many old groups have been. So, but anyway, any further around this? Another question pertains to, what do you think are changes that are likely to remain permanent um, beyond this pandemic, taking things that have happened. You talked about resetting and recalibrating. You talked about changing business models. So some thoughts around some of those. So I'll stick with these three first, and then we come
Sure.
to some. I will, for the audience, I'm just mentioning that since there are many questions coming from many of our participants, I am taking the liberty of not actually mentioning your names because I'm trying to bucket those into some themes. But the people who've asked the questions will know they have been asked. And yes, thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Singhania. So the first point on China, yes, we started working on it right away. The minute we realized that the relationship between India and China was going down a slope. So we have multiple kind of engagements with China. During the crisis, or during April, May, June, July, we were exporting a lot of steel into China, but that was always temporary. We knew that the minute the Indian market picked up, we would be back to selling steel in India. That was just to keep our facilities loaded, and the fact that China was importing steel. So that was one dependence which we knew was temporary, and we are already out of it. I think we are already, as we speak, hardly exporting anything to China. The second part is we import consumables from China, and we import capital equipment from China. Okay, so that's a trickier part. So we started developing alternate sources, because these are not consumables that you can just switch from one supplier to another. These are consumables where you run trials. It could be refractories, it could be rolls, it could be anything else in a steel plant, which cannot just be switched from one supplier to another, because there is a process of using it, testing it, approving it, and then scaling it up, right? So we've already started the journey. Okay, it doesn't matter that we pay 20% more or 30% more to buy it from some other country, but we said let's de-risk. Let's not be, vulnerable to this geopolitical relationship, because 10 years back, 15 years back, everyone was had a go to China kind of strategy, right? How would you open up offices in China to buy stuff and bring it into India? So that de-risking has already started. And we are on that journey, because that takes time. It takes a year or two, cannot happen overnight. So we're well into that. So tomorrow, even if the relationship between India and China is fine, we will always have a strategy which will say that a certain percentage of critical consumables has to be sourced from outside China, even if it is more expensive, so that you can scale up that option at short notice. The second part on Atmanirbhar, you said it all. Tata Steel was set up on an idea of Atmanirbhar, that India as a country needs to produce steel, and that's why we are 113 years old in steel making. And we are very happy, because this means our customers, and we'll have more customers in India, if not using steel in the factories, at least using steel to build the factories, right? So we are very happy with this initiative of the government. We believe that India is a great place for manufacturing. We have some challenges, but those challenges can be dealt with. It's not easy to build scale, and Atmanirbhar helps us build scale. As a steel industry, we have been criticized in the past and said that we are not competitive. I will not agree to that. That's because we confuse cost and price. If somebody sells at a low price, doesn't mean they're competitive. They're competitive, they make money selling at a low price. So I think that's a problem we've had, and we've demonstrated that not just Tata Steel, all the other steel companies in India have exported to China at profitable prices during this crisis. So India is blessed with raw materials. India is blessed with the manpower. India has a technology now in terms of digital technologies. No reason why we can't build a strong manufacturing base in India. And I think we are very happy with that journey. And I think Tata Steel, over the last 5 years, 6 years, has spent almost 60,000 crores, 70,000 crores building capacity in India organically and inorganically. So our commitment is there, and we'll continue to invest in growing in India. The last part is what are the changes which will be permanent? I think a lot has already happened. I certainly see, the future being somewhere between the present and what was pre-pandemic and what is current. It's not that we will not travel. We will travel, but we will travel much less than we used to. We will use technology much more than we have traditionally done. We need to rethink protocols for the offices, I think, and the workplaces. We need to really think. To me, location has become irrelevant increasingly for many jobs. It doesn't matter where you sit, as long as you're connected. So there are many changes. So it's not just about embedding technology in your existing processes. It is about rethinking your processes in the context of the technology that is available, right? So we have, from Tata Steel, from 1st November, we're going to have new policies on, which will give a lot of flexibility to employees if their jobs can be location independent, right? And which also helps us tap into a workforce which may not have been otherwise available. For instance, there are a lot of talented women who are today not tapped into because of some constraints that they may have, and today we can tap into their talent. And so there are many other such opportunities for us. So I think the future will be somewhere different, or somewhere between the present and the past.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can we take a few more questions, Mr. Narendran?
Sure.
Till what time do we go? And Mr. Narendran, what is comfortable for you? And we can.
We have till 7 o'clock.
Oh,
yeah,
we have.
I blocked time till 7. Yeah.
Yeah, that's because we're getting plenty of questions coming in fast and not furious, but tennis player like. One question which is clearly there and which is actually, frankly, in my mind as well, is could you elaborate a little bit more about the digital strategy? That is one of the points that you mentioned. And of course, strategy was not a COVID-induced strategy. It was there early. And in fact, if I may be personal, I may, in due course, we may be reaching out to your organization from our side to understand, because whenever we talk to people, they quote Tata Steel as an example. It's a very good example of a digital, a particular, digital transformation, particularly in the manufacturing sector.
Yeah.
So that is one question I'd like to put to you. The
Sure.
other, I think, a very interesting question regarding our, particularly for a management point of view, is in terms of, HR issues. We've all faced, managers in this crisis, the dilemma of having to let people go or cut back on certain privileges or perquisites. On the other hand, a different kind of skill set that is perhaps required, retraining and reskilling people. So this whole issue of recruitment of appropriate people on the one hand, perhaps retiring or letting go or early retirement of some, and how do we motivate the organization through this crisis, and how do we handle this HR dilemma? I think this is a big one across all organizations, how to keep employees engaged. And you talked about this, but a little more on some of those kinds of things. And one, I'll again leave it with the third question. In terms of, you did talk about your overseas plants sort of giving you early signals, but how have they responded to this crisis? Has their response there been any sort of different, and have there been learnings from there to us in India? I'll pause here for the moment.
Sure. Thanks. So let me deal with the first one, which is digital transformation journey. Yeah, I think we are quite proud of what we've achieved, but there's a lot more to do. Our efforts have been recognized recently by the World Economic Forum. They have this thing of calling factories digital lighthouses. So our plant in Netherlands was the first steel plant in the world to get that recognition about 3 years back. And last year, our plant in Kalinganagar was the first manufacturing site in India across industry to get that recognition. So we have some experience, but like I said, there's a lot of work to do. So it started maybe about 4 or 5 years back, actually, this journey. So there are a few things we did. So to me, any digital transformation is like any change management program. There has to be commitment top down and there has to be commitment bottom up. and it's not just one person or the CEO or the CIO or somebody saying that it's a good idea. So what we did when we started this journey about 4 or 5 years back, and I think Rekha will know this, we've been sending people on this AIMA program to the west coast of US every year. And pretty much most of our leadership team went on this trip and other trips. The whole idea was to open up people's mind to what was happening. So once the leadership team had gone there, seen what was happening in the US and in other places, or in Europe, they went to, people visited Germany, France, digital centers, so on and so forth. So we spent some money sending a lot of people, maybe the top 20 people, to multiple places, some with consultants, some went on their own, whatever. But it opened up their minds. So they knew that there was something happening out there and they needed to be part of it. The second thing we did was we did a reverse mentoring program. We started with the top 20 in the company and then we rolled it out for the top 300. We said every leader should have a mentor who is less than 30 years old. Okay, so the mentor was a youngster in the company. People had to apply to be a mentor. So you had some 300-400 youngsters applying to be the mentors and 20 of them got picked to be mentors to the top 20 leaders. So it addressed two things. One is, again, the whole, you picked mentors who knew the subject, and most youngsters know the subject better than people of our age, right? So it helped the leaders engage with these youngsters and ask questions and learn about what is happening at that time. Augmented reality, virtual reality, these are all fairly new words 3, 4, 5 years back for most of us. Maybe people in the tech sector knew it inside out, but how can it be applied in manufacturing? What can we do? How can it help us in maintenance? Whatever. So when we did this reverse mentoring program, it also helped us connect with the youngsters, because when we looked at the engagement scores in Tata Steel, we saw that the people below 30 had the lowest engagement scores. So this way, the leaders connected with the youngsters and picked up a lot of messages from them, not only in the digital side, but also what is happening in their lives. And the youngsters also got a way to connect with the leaders. So we rolled this program out and that helped us. Third is we developed a plan. We had a new CIO and we brought him from TCS, who was, again, knew the industry, but from outside, so he was not limited by a typical Tata Steel person has spent all his life in Tata Steel. So this is an area you needed an outside-in view rather than an inside-out view. So we got in somebody from outside. Jayanto came in from TCS. He had 25, 30 years experience there, seen the world, helped us develop a plan. And we said this plan will require investments. We spent a lot of money building the infrastructure because we are in many remote locations. So you can say all that you want, but if you have poor Wi-Fi connectivity in some of these places, it doesn't help to say you're in a digital transformation program, right? Simple things. You need to allow people to have either handheld devices, laptops, whatever. You can't have a laptop policy which says you will only get laptops if you're a certain level or whatever, right? So you need to really rethink some of these policies that we traditionally have in the manufacturing sector, particularly. So we invested a lot of money in infrastructure. We also set a target. We said we should have $2 billion of savings in the next 5 years. Okay, so it was not just a nice thing to do and everyone talks of projects. We said, let's see how the projects stack up and what are the savings that we can get out of it. And this is where the bottom-up ideas also started coming in, because we told our guys on the shop floor, please come up with ideas that will help you. So it could be very simple ideas. I mean, for instance, in our tubes division, since you sell tubes by numbers, a lot of time was wasted by the transporter in counting how many tubes are there in a bundle, right? A simple solution like you take a photograph and it automatically counts, saved maybe many hours and more than that convenience, right? So like this, or it could be very complex solutions. So there would be a lot of ideas which made it relevant for people down the line and not just some strategic projects. While at the same time, we started building capabilities. We started, getting people trained on data sciences. And one of my colleagues in Europe put it well when he said that it's easier to make a metallurgist a data scientist than a data scientist a metallurgist. So it was about training our own people, having a mix of people from outside, while at the same time training our own people. And then having a sensorization strategy, investing in sensorization, investing in analytics, artificial intelligence, so on and so forth. So today we have at least 100 plus algorithms running in Tata Steel and growing by the day, solving day-to-day issues. It could be safety analytics. We had, we have huge numbers of people coming in, contract workers and otherwise. So we had RFID for all of them. So for instance, just to give an example, during the pandemic, so we would get an alert if social distancing norms were broken and there was a cluster of people because everyone had an RFID card. So it would get an alert if you say that there are 10 people gathered here in the plant, right? So this is a practical solution to a technology solution to a practical problem. So I think this transformation journey is very strong, it's owned by the business. If you come to Tata Steel, we are most welcome. You will see that the presentations you made by the business guys, not by the IT guys. Second point is on HR. Yes, it's an important thing. We are taken a view as a group and as Tata Steel that we are not going to lay off people because of COVID. Every year, there are performance-related separations which happen. That will continue to happen because that is more to do with performance than with COVID. And that is a very small number oftentimes. But COVID, we said no. Everyone gets kind of, their jobs are protected. Not only that, at a group level, we've taken a view, at least for those first 2-3 months, that the smaller contractors, we will pay their contract workers, even if they don't have a job in Tata Steel. So if there was somebody doing a job in Tata Steel, but because the plant was shut or operating at less capacity, if they didn't have that work, we told the smaller contractors. The bigger contractors, we said, you have to take care of yourself. Smaller contractors, we said, we'll pay your labor. You give us a bill, vet it, and we will pay for it, and which we did in April, May, and I think part of June, at least that first quarter. So on HR issues, I think people want to see that you're sensitive. I think people were very committed. It was work from home, but people were working very hard. Of course, what we didn't cut any salaries, but we said no increments for the year. We gave them bonuses because these were the bonuses that they accrued because of last year's performance, and we gave them that. So we did that, and I think people were happy with some of those actions. In terms of overseas plants, we have 2 major sites in Netherlands and in UK. We make 7 million tons in Netherlands and 3 million in UK. And we make 1 million tons each in Singapore and Thailand. Thailand was the least affected. Singapore was initially unaffected, but then you had a spate of cases. So we had to shut down the plant and, it took us a while. Europe, the customers closed. So while the plants were running, we were running at 60-70% capacity because the customers were closed. And then, even now, I think the recovery is there. But in Europe, we also got a lot of support from the governments, as we did in Singapore, in terms of direct support, because they had schemes where you get a percentage of salary of people who sit at home because your plant is running at less capacity and things like that. So different conditions, but I think the recovery has been fastest in India. So Indian plants are today, we are running at 100%. Europe, we are still running at 70-80%. And in Thailand and Singapore also, we are now running close to 100%.
Great, thank you very much. There are people who would want to know, how do you see, particularly post-pandemic, not to do with pandemic really, but the future, how demand for a commodity like steel would really shape out? And is this likely to be affected positively or negatively, or will it ultimately come back? And in any case, even before pandemic, there were other challenges around that. And particularly for a country like India, would there be any sort of changes either way?
Sure. So I think what has happened is you lost a year or two, right? But I think we believe that, you slipped this year. In India, the steel demand this year will be maybe 20% less than it was last year. Not so visible in the performance of the steel companies because all of us have exported more than we normally do. So, the sales in India may be 20% less, but the production may not be significantly less because we had an export option. So next year, you will see strong growth, but that is only catching up with where you were last year, right? And catching up with what you lost this year. Similarly, in the rest of the world, China is going to show growth in steel demand, and that is very important because China accounts for about 55% of the steel consumption in the world. So China produces more steel in a month than India does in a year now. And China is growing at 8% or 9% as far as steel consumption is concerned. So, so it's an amazing kind of impact on the balance of demand supply. And that's why raw material prices, coking coal and iron ore, which have been a bit soft in the last week or so, but are still much higher than they've been for a long time, particularly iron ore, right? And that's reflective of what's happening in China. We believe the response in Europe has been much better than the response in Europe in 2008. I think the governments have been far more coordinated and responded well. US is always resilient, will always come back. Uh, you know, China, like I said, has bounced back already. And we believe India next year will bounce back. I think in the medium to long term, we are positive and bullish about India, simply because of the fact that if we believe India as a country will grow, steel consumption has to grow at least at the rate at which the GDP grows. And with this initiative on Atmanirbhar Bharat, if manufacturing as a percentage of GDP moves from the 15, 16, 17% to the 20, 25% that we'd like to be, that's again good for steel consumption. So we continue to be bullish on steel. And we believe the recovery in manufacturing will be quicker and better than the recovery in services. The recovery in rural India will be quicker and better than the recovery in urban India. And all this also means that we need to find ways to sell more steel in rural India. And I think there are many opportunities for us to do that. We are already doing that. We obviously need to look at the investments which are flowing into India, because even if you're manufacturing electronics, you need to make a factory to make that electronics, and those factories use steel. So we are very bullish going forward on the steel consumption in India.
Excellent. That's good to hear, because this is a basic this is a basic commodity, and very often these questions get asked in terms of future like this. One other thing you've talked about right now, you mentioned your optimism for demand revival globally as well as India. One question, Mr. Narendran, which is being asked across businesses, is that right now, as we speak, we are seeing in many sectors, or a resurgence, if I may say, in demand. Of course, there are different shades. So, for example, steel companies are seeing an upswing, auto companies are seeing an upswing, but this morning's newspaper said the two-wheelers, for example, are relatively less. Many other sectors, we've been surprised ourselves in some of the sectors we operate, like tires and cement, etc., how they have been able to, they're surprisingly doing better than many others. So the question really is, what is our thinking? And here, maybe because of your industry association and all experience as well, is this likely to be a short-term situation? People talk of the pent-up demand, supply chain disruptions, and we're looking at the festive season. So post-festive season, do we believe that this may sustain? Now, I know there are no perfect or clear answers, but what's your sort of understanding or educated guess around this? And would you believe that more sort of needs to be done in terms of providing greater stimuli to the economy?
Yeah, so it's an interesting point, and I think there's been different views, including we all choose all multiple alphabets to describe the recovery, and so somebody said K-shaped recovery, where some companies will do well and some companies will do badly. So to me, currently there is a bit of a pent-up demand which is getting serviced, but at the same time, I do believe that this can be sustained, but cannot be on autopilot. There needs to be continued nurturing of the recovery. And I think there are 2-3 areas which we need to work on. I think one thing is clear: the rural economy is doing much better. I think we've had good monsoons, good harvest. So anything which is sold in the rural economy has recovered faster, whether it's tractors, motorcycles, even our steel products, roofing sheets, which sells into the rural markets, has recovered faster than what sells more in the urban markets. It's good that the automotive demand has come back. More than anything else, it's a big driver of sentiment, right? And I think, and there's a huge ecosystem which depends on auto, particularly the MSME ecosystem, because the MSME ecosystem needs to be nurtured. If you see the impact of the pandemic, even in China, the companies who got hurt the most are the MSMEs, right? And so there is a need to nurture that sector. There is a need to be watchful. There is a need to help them. I heard a number recently which said that it is the people with income below 15,000 rupees a month who got impacted more than people above that. So we need to be very watchful about the urban poor in some sense. Also the MSME sector, people who are impacted by that. The way, in some sense, is for the government to continue to focus on infrastructure building. The government over the last year or so has announced a lot of plans for infrastructure. I know resource and revenues is an issue, but GST collections have also started going up because infrastructure is a big force multiplier, right? Many MSMEs benefit from spend on infrastructure. Infrastructure also spreads activity because and even now the government is building a lot of rural infrastructure, which is very important. So it's not just limited to driving consumption or demand in urban sector. So I think the recovery is sustainable, but will not happen on its own, needs to be nurtured. And I think focus on MSMEs and infrastructure is what I would say.
Right. We are almost getting out of time. I just want to ask one question which sort of encompasses a lot of businesses, which is, we have talked a lot, and not just on this conversation we're having today, but over a period of time, we have been talking a lot about, coming back partly to Atmanirbhar and attracting FDI and a whole lot of other things. One of the things I think which we need to sort of consider is what is the competitiveness of Indian business, particularly the manufacturing sector. You remarked rightly so that government wants the manufacturing to be about 20-25% of GDP, and frankly this desire has been there even from the previous regimes. If you look back at UPA, 1, etc., UPA 2, and all of that was there. The issue is somewhere along the line we are not being able to accomplish this. So if I may offer one viewpoint, I have for long submitted to the government or on anything that whatever policies that we do, we sort of look through the filter of, is this going to increase competitiveness of Indian business? I just want to have your views and reactions. It's a big statement on a simplistic platform, but your thinking around this, because steel is one of the businesses, but even in the Tata Group, you have so many manufacturing businesses.
Sure.
You're privy to understanding.
Sure. So it's a very important question to address if we have to drive this journey, right? To me, there are two elements of competitiveness. There is a competitiveness inside the factory gate, and there's a competitiveness outside the factory gate. Industry should be driven to be the best in the world inside the factory gate. There's no excuses for not being otherwise, right? So everyone should be benchmarked within the factory gate on what are the best numbers in the world and where are you compared to that. Okay, could be productivity, could be whatever, efficiency, so on, energy efficiency, whatever, right? Then there is a competitiveness outside the factory gate, which we can, to some extent, address at our cost as industry. But that is where I think the governments, and it's not just the central government, but also the state governments need to work on. You may be the best inside your factory. Independent authorities will certify that Tata Steel is one of the lowest cost producers of steel in the world, particularly our Jamshedpur plant, right? But if I have to spend $50-60 getting that steel to Bombay, and POSCO from Korea can get it for $20 to Bombay, what do I do, right? So one needs to then really look at how do I address that $40 additional cost which I have to incur because of road or rail or whatever. And that is, as far as the customer in Bombay is concerned, he doesn't care, right? So to me, when you talk competitiveness, there is a part which is in control of the industry, which the industry should be tasked to deliver on. And there is a part which the industry and the government needs to work together. And there is a lot of work that the government needs to support, because it calls for infrastructure investment. Sometimes it calls for policy changes. Like GST is a good example of driving competitiveness, right? Otherwise because in India, the cost of money is high. So time is expensive. If you take 10 years to build a steel plant in India because of the fact that acquiring land and getting clearances takes a lot of time, that's a lot of cost when you look at the cost of capital in India and for a steel plant which costs 25,000 crores, right? As opposed to China, which may have built 600 million tons of steel capacity in 10 years, right? So this is where, competitiveness is not just something that you beat the industry with. I think both industry and government need to work together if you want to address it at a structural level.
Thank you very much for that very clear response. reinforces my own views there, if I can say humbly, but it is. And I think we all face this as managers, as leaders in operating Indian businesses. And this is true, by the way, as much for Tata Steel as it would be for an MSME that you talked and emphasized about,
Absolutely. Yeah.
and within their own spheres. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we are sort of complete on our time. Rekha, do you want to make any closing remarks, or do you want me to just leave it to thank Mr. Narendran?
I just want to say what it was fantastic having you here with us, Mr. Narendran. I know you're very busy, but I hope we'll have you back again in future. A lot of what you said really struck a chord, whether it's, more meetings, digitization. I think what has really happened is that attitudes have changed, and that has helped us all. I mean, I could never think of having a video call with the vice chancellor, for example, of a university, uh, or government officials, but now things are changing. And it's fantastic to see how Tata Steel has responded to it under your leadership. So thank you so much for joining us, and I'll leave it to Mr. Singhania to wrap up now.
Thanks, Rekha.
I have not too much to add. We have heard Mr. Narendran, ladies and gentlemen, with his very lucid comments and very clear. And I must say, I will go away from this webinar, seminar, interaction, call it whatever you want, much richer and wiser in my thoughts. And I don't say this out of flattery, but I say this genuinely, that your clarity of thought has helped me in many ways. And I'm
Thank you.
sure it would have been the same experience for all our participants today. And really, so this is where I think we derive value from having people like you, who are leaders in not only the Indian industry but even on a global scale, for AIMA. And I was very happy to note one thing. When you talked and elaborated on the digital journey, AIMA was featuring as well a part of it, but it
A
seemed
very
like,
important part of it. A very
yeah.
important part of it. Yeah.
So Rekha, I think you should get that as an endorsement.
Rekha's made a lot of money out of Tata Steel because of that.
No, but I must say, Mr. Narendran, not many leaders have that foresight, because I have been personally on those programs. It changes your outlook completely. So if you're
Absolutely.
looking to
Absolutely.
change mindsets, that's the way to go. And
Yeah.
incidentally, there have been close to 1,000 people watching this. We have just got the numbers from our social media channels. We had about 750 people on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. And of course, we had about 300 here. So
Thank you.
fantastic.
Thank you.
Rekha,
Thank you, Mr. Singhania. And thank you, Rekha. My
the se-
privilege, as I said.
the
Yeah.
season of IPL, where people are breaking centuries, we are talking about getting into four digits here. Really, thank you, Mr. Narendran, for
Thank
all
you.
this. We will continue to interact with you, and thank you for all your support to AIMA.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Singhania. Really appreciate it.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Thanks, Rekha. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
For all delegates, we'll have the next session of Leaders Speak on the 30th of October with Saurabh Mukherjee of Marcellus, and it will be moderated by Mohandas Pai. Thank you.
Thanks, Rekha. I think
Thank you.
great session.